Some land gets fought over for what it's worth. Some land gets fought over for what it means to the person holding it.
She had held this place together for 8 months alone. She knew every sound it made.
Then she heard it. The sound that didn't belong to August.
He had been watching this land for 3 years. He had decided the time had finally come. She had 60 days, 1 signature, and now he was at her door.
Texas, 1886. The land outside Mill Creek had a quality in August that a man could not quite name and could not quite forget. The grass burned gold by midsummer heat, the creek running low but steady between its limestone banks, the sky so wide and blue it felt less like weather and more like a permanent condition of the country itself. A man riding through that land for the first time understood immediately why people had fought over it. Why they had come from other places and stayed and built things meant to outlast them. Not just for what the land could produce, but for what it felt like to stand in the middle of it and look in every direction and see nothing that required anything of you except your presence. Callum Danner had been riding through other people's country his entire life. He was 28 years old, lean and deliberate in the way of men who have learned early that effort spent carelessly is effort wasted and cannot be recovered. He had worked cattle operations from the Panhandle to the Red River, had fixed fences on land that belonged to men he would never eat supper with, had slept in bunk houses where the walls were thin and the work started before the sun and ended after it, and the pay was fair and the belonging was not included in the arrangement. He had been useful in the way a good tool is useful, reliable, well-suited to its purpose, set down when the job was finished and the season turned. He had ridden 3 days from Abilene following word of a cattle operation outside Mill Creek that was short-handed and looking. The directions had been vague in the way of directions given by men who know a country so well they have forgotten what it looks like to someone who doesn't. Follow Tanner Creek north past the second crossing. Look for the red barn on the east side of the road. You'll know it when you see it. The barn was where it was supposed to be. So was the farmhouse beside it, solid limestone and timber well built, the kind of construction that spoke of original intention rather than accumulated improvisation. Someone had planned this place carefully. Someone had wanted it to last beyond the planning. The yard was swept clean. The kitchen garden had been tended recently enough that the rows were still straight and the weeds had not yet reasserted themselves. The barn doors were hung straight and moved on their hinges without protest when the August wind pushed against them. These were not the details of a neglected operation. These were the details of a place being held together by someone who had decided at some point, and for reasons that were entirely their own, that it was not going to fall. Not on their watch. Not while there was still work that could be done to prevent it. Callum tied his horse at the gate post and walked to the porch and knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what he had assembled in his mind during the 3-day ride. She was 26 years old, dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who considered it a practical matter rather than an aesthetic one, something to be managed rather than displayed. Dark eyes that did what eyes rarely did. They completed their full assessment before her expression committed to anything at all, before her face gave back any information about what the assessment had found. She was wearing a blue work dress, practical and clean, with a small pattern of flowers along the sleeve that seemed less like decoration and more like a remnant of a time when she had bought fabric for reasons other than durability alone. She was holding a ledger book. She did not set it down when she opened the door. She looked at him the way you look at a fence before you decide whether to repair it or pull the whole line and start again from the ground up. He took off his hat. "Ma'am, I heard you might be needing a hand. I have experience with cattle operations, fencing, general ranch work, and I need a husband more than a cowboy," she said. Not unkindly, not as provocation or challenge or the opening move of a negotiation. The way you state something that arithmetic has already settled and sentiment has not been invited to revise, because the arithmetic is not interested in sentiment's opinion. She looked at him with those assessing eyes while he stood on her porch with his prepared remarks dissolving in the August heat like salt in water. "Come in," she said. "I'll explain the situation." And she turned and walked back inside, still holding the ledger as if the conversation had already progressed to a point beyond the threshold, and he simply needed to catch up. Callum stood on the porch for a moment. The horse at the gatepost waited with the patient indifference of an animal that has learned over years not to have opinions about human decisions. Then Callum followed her inside because when a woman like that opens a door and says, "Come in," you come in. You figure out the rest after. You ask your questions once you're in the room and can see what you're actually dealing with. Her name was Maren Whitfield. She explained everything at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, in the afternoon light coming through the west window at the angle that made the numbers easy to read and harder to argue with. Her husband Thomas had died in May 8 months previous. A fever fast and without negotiation, the kind that arrives on a Tuesday afternoon and is finished by Friday morning and leaves no room for preparation or goodbye. It had left her with 300 acres of good Texas land, 60 head of cattle, 2 horses in sound condition, a barn that needed its east roof section repaired before the rains came, and a debt of $420 to the Mill Creek Savings Bank. Thomas had borrowed the money the previous spring to expand the herd, convinced that cattle prices were moving in a direction that would make the expansion straightforward and the debt manageable. He had been a man of genuine optimism. She said this without bitterness, just as a fact about his character, one of the facts that had made him who he was. The prices had not moved fast enough, and Thomas had not lived long enough to manage the difference between what he had projected and what had arrived. Under the coverture laws that still cast their long shadow over Texas property rights in 1886, a widow in probate existed in a specific and uncomfortable kind of legal limbo. The estate was technically unsettled until the probate process completed itself, and the bank could, and Burton Crane at Mill Creek Savings was making clear with the careful politeness of a man who genuinely considered himself reasonable and answerable to his depositors, that it would call the note rather than extend new terms to a woman without a husband's signature on the refinancing documents. Not out of personal animosity toward Maren Whitfield specifically, out of what the law permitted him to do and what his obligations to the bank's depositors required him to consider. She had 60 days before the note came due. She had thought through every other available option, and she explained them with the same precision she brought to the ledger columns, with the same unwillingness to let wishful thinking occupy the space where arithmetic belonged. Selling cattle, she would need to move 40 head at current summer prices to cover the debt, which would leave her without enough animals to run the operation through winter and into spring calving season, which meant she would not be selling just cattle. She would be selling the operation's future alongside them mortgaging next year to pay for today in a way that had no recovery path she could identify. Borrowing from family, she had none within practical reach. Fighting the bank's position in court, the lawyer in Mill Creek, a man named Garrett, whose opinion she trusted despite finding it entirely unhelpful, had told her the legal challenge would take longer than 60 days and cost money she did not have available for litigation. She needed a husband's signature on the refinancing documents. That was the mechanical fact at the center of everything. The one lever the law had left available. The one door that had not been closed by Thomas's death or the bank's timeline or the 60 days that were running out regardless of what she decided. "I've asked 2 other men," she said. She set the ledger flat on the table and looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him at the door, completely, without the social habit of softening a difficult truth with the performance of reluctance about delivering it. The first one laughed. Not cruelly, I think he simply found the proposition so outside his understanding of how arrangements like this were supposed to work that laughter was the only response that came to him. The second one understood the arrangement and attempted to renegotiate its terms in a direction I found unacceptable. She let that statement settle without elaboration, and Callum understood precisely and completely what it meant without needing the elaboration. "So I'm telling you plainly what I'm offering and what I need in return, and I'd like you to take the night to think about it before you answer." The terms were 4, and she laid them out with the same clarity she had laid out everything else. He would have a home and a room in the house, the small bedroom off the kitchen that Thomas had used as a study still full of Thomas's books and papers, which she had not yet sorted because there had not been time for sorting when there was so much else that needed doing. He would receive $40 a month once the debt was refinanced and the operation was on stable footing again. He would have a genuine share in the operation's decisions, meaning his experience and judgment would be treated as real contributions to how the place was run, not as decoration or performance of participation. And in return, she needed his name on the bank documents, his actual labor on this property through the seasons ahead, and his honest intention to remain through at least one full year and make an honest assessment from there. "You don't know me," Callum said. "No," she said, "but I know 3 things about you that I did not know about either of the other 2 men before I asked them. You came here looking for honest work rather than for an angle. You took your hat off when I opened the door, which is a small thing, and also not a small thing. And you didn't laugh when I explained the situation." She looked at him steadily across the table, across the open ledger, and the columns of numbers that told the full and honest story of what she was asking him to step into. "That is more than I was able to say about either of the last 2. I'll give you my answer in the morning," he said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has already accepted that this is the shape of the process and is not going to perform impatience about it, because impatience at this point would serve nothing and cost something. "The barn is clean. There's food in the kitchen covered on the counter." She picked up her ledger and walked back to her accounting without ceremony. Callum took a plate from the kitchen cold biscuits and sliced beef left covered with a cloth in the matter-of-fact hospitality of a woman who fed working people without making ceremony of the feeding, and walked out to the barn to think. It was as she had said, a clean barn. He checked the animals the way he always checked animals when he arrived at a new property, not to demonstrate competence to anyone watching, but because animals told you the truth of a place before anything else did, before the people could arrange the presentation of it. Neglected land showed in its animals first in the quality of their coats, in the clarity of their eyes, in the way they moved and what they did when a stranger came near. These animals were calm and well-fed, and their coats were in good condition for August. The horse nearest the door stretched its neck over the stall rail and regarded him with the mild, unbothered curiosity of an animal that has been handled well and has no particular reason to be suspicious of strangers. Callum lay down in the hay with the barn quiet and warm around him and looked up at the rafters and thought for a long time. He had worked other men's land his entire adult life. He had told himself in the various bunk houses and line camps and borrowed bedrolls of 28 years that this was freedom, that a man who owned nothing was burdened by nothing, that the ability to ride on when the season ended was its own kind of wealth, something to be valued rather than mourned. He was beginning to understand in the particular quiet of another man's barn on another man's land that this had been a story he had been telling himself because the alternative was harder to carry. The alternative was that he had simply never been given a reason to stop, never found a place that asked something of him beyond his usefulness and offered something beyond his wages. He thought about Maren Whitfield's ledger, about the way she had laid out the entire situation without apology and without performance. Just the facts arranged in their proper order, the problem defined with precision, the solution proposed directly. He had worked for men his whole life. He had sat across tables from ranchers who explained what they needed with the casual authority of people who assumed without examination that their needs were the natural and unquestioned center of any conversation about the work. This had been different. She had asked him. She had told him to take the night and come back with his answer, and she had meant it as a genuine offer of time rather than a formality before the foregone conclusion. He thought about the echo. There was something he had noticed over years of working on other men's properties. When you drove a nail into someone else's barn when the hammer came down and the nail went in and the wood received it, the sound it made had a particular quality of hollowness to it. Not bad work, just borrowed. Work that returned nothing to the man doing it except the knowledge that he had done it competently for someone else's benefit. He had always believed in a part of himself he examined rarely and carefully, that the sound would be different if the nail went into something that was genuinely his, that the echo would change, that he would hear the difference and know it for what it was. He did not know if this was that. It was one night and he had known this woman for 4 hours, and the arrangement she was proposing was more unusual than anything he had encountered in 28 years of moving through other people's lives and properties. But the barn was clean and the animals were healthy, and the woman with the ledger had looked at him the way you look at something you are actually seeing rather than something you need to be a certain way. And she had told him to take the night, and she had meant it. He was still thinking when he noticed the rider. It was past 10 o'clock. The barn had gone fully dark except for the thin line of moonlight coming through the gap under the east wall. He had not been sleeping. He had been on his back in the hay with his eyes open and his mind working, which was different from sleeping and sometimes more useful. The movement outside registered the way sounds and movements always registered when you had spent years sleeping in exposed places. Not as alarm, not as fear, but as the specific quiet attention of a mind that has learned to note what doesn't fit the ordinary pattern of nighttime sounds and movements and file it away for examination. He went to the barn door and looked out through the gap between the door and the frame without opening it. There was a man on horseback on the ridgeline to the east, not moving, simply sitting his horse with the stillness of a man who has been watching something from a distance for a long time and is entirely comfortable with the practice, who has done this before on other nights and found it worthwhile. The moonlight was sufficient to see the shape of the man and the horse, but not the details of either. He was watching the farmhouse. Callum watched the rider for 2 full minutes. Then the man turned his horse and rode east along the ridgeline at a walk unhurried and disappeared into the dark without looking back. The way a man moves when he knows the territory thoroughly and is not concerned about being observed or followed. Callum stood at the barn door for a long moment after the rider was gone and thought about what it meant. A man on horseback watching a widow's farmhouse at 10 o'clock on an August night, riding east toward the neighboring property, when he was done watching unhurried, as if the watching were simply one item among others on a regular schedule. As if the farmhouse were something he checked on regularly, the way you check on a thing you are waiting to become available. He filed it away carefully. He would need more information before it resolved into something specific and actionable. But he filed it the way you file a fence post that leans in the wrong direction, not a crisis yet, not something to act on tonight, but something to watch and understand before it became urgent. In the morning, Callum came to the kitchen at 6 o'clock. Maren was already up, coffee on the stove, bacon in the pan, the ledger open on the corner of the table where she had apparently been working before she started breakfast. Because the woman seemed to treat the two activities as requiring approximately equal priority and saw no reason why either should entirely displace the other. She looked up when he came in through the kitchen door. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment across the kitchen. Something moved through her face, not relief performed for his benefit, but the controlled exhale of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a long time and has just found a second pair of hands willing to take part of the weight. Not celebration, just the quiet acknowledgement that the arithmetic had changed in the direction she needed it to change. "Sit down," she said. "We'll go to town this afternoon." They were married at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday at the Mill Creek Church with Reverend Aldous Veck officiating and 2 witnesses from the congregation who had been drafted into service with the matter-of-fact efficiency that Maren apparently brought to all logistical problems. Maren wore her good dress a deep green with small buttons down the front, worn with the practical composure of a woman who understood that occasions required appropriate presentation without requiring that you feel about them more than they actually warranted. Callum wore the dark shirt he kept rolled at the bottom of his saddlebag for situations that called for something better than what he worked in. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Reverend Veck, a long-practiced man of moderate but genuine sentimentality, read the words with the measured gravity of someone who had presided over enough weddings to understand that what made a marriage real was not the ceremony itself, but everything that came after it, and who suspected, watching these two particular people stand in front of him, that they understood this more clearly than most of the people he married. Walking back to the wagon in the afternoon light, Marin said, "Thank you." Callum said, "We should go over the cattle records tonight. I want to understand the full herd composition before the week is out." She looked at him sideways, a brief evaluating glance, the kind she gave when she was revising her understanding of something. "All right," she said. And for the first time since he had knocked on her door the previous morning, something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. It didn't fully arrive, but it was present the way a storm is present before it breaks in the quality of the air, in some shift of pressure, recognizable to anyone who had learned to read that particular kind of weather. What was also present as they drove back through Mill Creek's main street in the late afternoon was Wade Holcomb. He was standing outside Ruth Finley's general store, a large man in his middle 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time watching things from distances and has grown entirely comfortable with the practice. He watched their wagon pass with an expression that was not hostile and not neutral either. It was the expression of a man who has just received a piece of information and is in the process of deciding carefully and without rushing what it changes about his plans. Callum kept his eyes on the road ahead and did not acknowledge the watching. He had repaired enough broken things in 28 years to recognize the early signs of the kind of damage that began with a man watching from a distance and waiting for the right moment. The first weeks on the Whitfield property were entirely practical, which suited both of them. Callum worked from before sunrise to past dark, moving through the property with the systematic attention of someone learning a new instrument, not performing competence for an audience, but genuinely trying to understand how all the parts of the operation related to each other and what each part needed. The cattle, their condition and their numbers, and the quality of the grazing in each pasture. The fencing, which sections were sound and which were developing the slow lean that became a serious problem before it became a visible one. The water situation at the north end of the property, where the creek's low August level was creating problems that would need to be addressed before the dry months deepened. The barn roof on the east side, which was softening in a way that would become a genuine crisis before winter if it was not addressed in the remaining weeks of workable weather. He asked questions the way a man asks questions when he wants to understand a system rather than impress the person explaining it to him. Marin answered with the economy of someone who had been explaining this land to herself every single day for 8 months, turning it over in her mind, constantly accounting for every problem and every resource and every contingency, just to keep the whole picture clear enough to keep moving. She knew the property the way you know something you have been responsible for, completely not as information filed in the mind, but as something embedded in the body, the way a rancher knows where the soft ground is, not by thinking about it, but by the way the horse changes its step beneath them. She brought him a supper plate in the barn one evening in the 3rd week when he was working on the trace harness by lantern light. The trace harness was a piece of equipment Thomas had apparently been meaning to replace for at least a season and had not gotten around to replacing one of the small deferred maintenances that accumulate on a working property when there is always something more immediately urgent demanding attention. She set the plate on the workbench and looked at what he was doing. "That's the trace harness," she said. "Thomas kept saying he'd get to it." "The leather's still good," Callum said. "It's the stitching that's failing. It can be repaired properly and last another few years if the repair is done right." She watched him work for a moment. The barn was quiet around them except for the animals settling for the night and the sound of the awl moving through the leather in the lamplight. "He was a good man," she said. The statement was not defensive and not mournful. It was simply a piece of information. She was offering a fact about Thomas that she wanted him to have as context. He just wasn't always careful with the things that didn't seem urgent yet. Money sometimes, paperwork, the details that look small until they're not. Callum kept working the awl through the leather and thought about the note he had found at the back of the ledger, a note in Thomas's handwriting, dated April of 1886, written 6 weeks before he died. He had read it the night before he gave Marin his answer. He had read it twice more since then, just to make sure he had understood it correctly. "Holcomb has offered again. Third time, land office is showing boundary discrepancy from the 1874 survey. Need to check with Pratt and Abilene before winter. Thomas had not checked. Thomas had died in May, and whatever he had intended to do about the survey discrepancy and Holcomb's repeated offers had remained undone, waiting in the back of a ledger that Marin used every day, without knowing what was written in its final pages. Callum had found it. He had not told her. Not because he intended to keep it from her permanently, it was her land, in her ledger, in her dead husband's handwriting. He had not told her because he was not yet certain what it meant in full, and he had learned over 28 years that handing someone a problem before you understood its shape was worse than no information at all. A half-understood problem put fear in a person without giving them anything useful to do with the fear. He needed to understand the shape of it first. He needed to know what Holcomb had been planning and how far along the planning was and what could be done about it before he handed Marin one more thing to carry. The note in the ledger, he said it carefully testing the moment. Marin went very still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of someone who has been half expecting something and is deciding how to receive it now that it has arrived. Which note? The one Thomas wrote in April about the survey. The barn was quiet for a longer moment than most silences last. Callum kept working the harness and felt her processing this information the way you feel weather changing in the quality of the air around a person in some shift of atmosphere that is not quite visible but is entirely present. You found that, she said. The night before I gave you my answer, he said. I read the whole ledger before I decided. A pause. Why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't know what it meant yet, he said. And I didn't want to hand you a problem before I understood the shape of it. He set down the awl and looked at her. She was looking at him with those dark eyes that had been deciding things since the day he arrived, and what was in them now was something different from the assessment she had given him at the door. This was more careful than that, the specific expression of a person who is revising their understanding of a situation more significantly than they had expected to. What do you know so far, she said. That Holcomb has made 3 separate offers on this property, Callum said. That Thomas believed there was a discrepancy in the 1874 boundary survey. And that Holcomb mentioned the survey to me at the east fence last week in passing, the way a man mentions something he has been holding in reserve for the right moment. She sat down on the workbench beside the plate she had brought him. Holcomb spoke to you. He came by the east fence on Monday, said the 1874 survey had some irregularities worth knowing about. Said the bank was aware of it too. Said it might not be worth putting too much labor into the east pasture before the question was properly resolved. Callum picked up the awl again. He said all of it the way a man says something he's been planning to say for some time casually, like information shared between neighbors with the unhurried patience of someone who dropped a stone in water and rode away before the ripples finished spreading. Marin looked at her hands for a moment, then at the harness in his. What did you tell him? I drove the next fence post, Callum said. And that same evening I wrote a letter to Samuel Pratt in Abilene. He's a licensed surveyor. The county clerk mentioned his name when I pulled the original 1874 survey file last week. If the boundary error is real and documented, we need a corrected survey filed with the land office before Holcomb can move on it legally. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it, the silence of a person absorbing the information that someone else has been, quietly and without announcement, working on a problem that was fundamentally theirs and had been doing so for weeks before saying a word about it. You've been working on this since the east fence, she said. Since October, he said. Since the day Holcomb came by and told me exactly what he wanted me to worry about. Marin looked at the harness, then at the workbench, then at the plate of food she had brought out and set down, and that neither of them had touched. She picked it up and moved it so it sat between them on the wide workbench. There's enough for 2, she said. They ate supper in the barn without further discussion of Holcomb or surveys or boundary questions. The animals settled around them in the familiar sounds of a barn at night. The October evening came in cool through the gaps in the barn wall, carrying the smell of dry grass and the first edge of coming cold. It was the most comfortable either of them had been in the week since August, and neither of them said so because some things are understood and carried forward without needing to be named. The bank meeting had taken place 3 weeks after the wedding on a Thursday morning in September. Burton Crane at Mill Creek Savings was a small, precise man who gave the consistent impression of someone who considered himself thoroughly reasonable and was with some regularity not. Not out of malice or bad intention, out of the specific limitation of a man who had organized his thinking so completely around established procedures that he had gradually lost the ability to distinguish between what the procedures required and what they had been designed to accomplish. He reviewed the refinancing paperwork with the focused attention of someone who found comfort in documents, in the way that columns of numbers have, of making things feel settled and clear when the human situations behind them are anything but. He asked Callum 3 questions about the property: total acreage, current cattle count, outstanding improvements needed, with the expression of a man testing new equipment to see if it held under the weight he needed to put on it. He asked all 3 questions without once looking at Marin, who sat to Callum's left, with her hands folded on the table and her face arranged in the particular and deliberate stillness of a woman who has decided not to perform her feelings about being treated as furniture in a conversation about her own land. Callum answered all 3 questions from memory without looking to Marin to confirm without hesitation, with the specific and unglamorous precision of a man who had read every page of a ledger before agreeing to attach his name to what it represented. Crane signed the refinancing documents. Walking out into the Mill Creek afternoon, Marin said, "He looked at you like you had done something remarkable." "What did I do, ma'am?" "You answered his questions about my land," she said, without looking at me to check the answers. "I read the ledger," Callum said. "I know the property." She stopped walking on the Mill Creek sidewalk. The town moved around them, a wagon pulling through the intersection, 2 men talking outside the hardware store, Ruth Finley sweeping her front step and managing to convey through the particular angle of her broom and the quality of her attention to it that she had noticed them and was forming opinions she would share with her next several customers. Marin looked at Callum with the expression of a woman who has been steadily revising her understanding of a situation and has just moved the calculation another increment in a direction she had not fully anticipated. "The cattle records are in the second drawer of Thomas's desk," she said. "I'll show you the pasture rotation system after supper tonight." They started walking again. The September afternoon settled around them, and whatever was accumulating between them in the weeks since August continued its quiet accumulation without either of them yet finding the right name for it or the right moment to try. What Callum had not told her, because the moment was not yet right, because Pratt had not yet replied from Abilene, because a problem half understood was still worse than no information at all, was the full extent of what he had been doing with the weeks since he had found Thomas's note. He had read that note 4 times over. He had walked the east fence line twice in the first 2 weeks, studying the terrain and the existing boundary markers, and trying to understand from the physical geography of the land where a 90-foot survey error would actually fall and what the legal and practical implications would be. He had visited the county clerk's office in Mill Creek on a Thursday, presenting himself as a man newly arrived to a property and wanting to familiarize himself with the relevant public records, and had learned that the 1874 survey was on file and that there was a notation added later in a different hand flagging a possible instrument variation that had never been formally investigated or resolved. He had asked careful questions about Holcomb in the way of a man gathering background context rather than building a legal case, and what he had assembled was this: Wade Holcomb had been watching the Whitfield land since before Thomas's illness, made the watching opportunistic rather than merely interested. He owned 500 acres to the east and had made 2 formal purchase offers while Thomas was alive. Both declined. After Thomas's death, he had let it be known around Mill Creek, in the measured and careful way of a man who treats every word as an investment expected to return something, that a widow carrying a bank debt was in a genuinely difficult position, and that he hoped she would find her way through it. He had not specified what he hoped she would find her way to. He had been waiting with the specific patience of a man who has identified what he wants, has assessed the field correctly, and is willing to take whatever time is necessary for circumstances to arrange themselves in his favor. The letter from Samuel Pratt arrived at the end of October. It was professional and precisely worded. Pratt knew the 1874 survey from his own earlier work in the county. He had in fact flagged the potential instrument variation in the compass reading at the time it was done and submitted a formal notation to the county office, which had been received and filed and never acted upon. He could be in Mill Creek by the second week of November if the eastern boundary needed to be properly surveyed and the corrected documents filed with the land office. Callum wrote back the same evening the letter arrived. That same evening, working on the trace harness in the barn, he had told Marin everything: Thomas's note, the letter to Pratt, the weeks of walking the fence line and reading county records and piecing together the shape of what Holcomb had been building toward across 3 years and 3 offers and 1 carefully dropped remark at an east fence on an October Monday. And she had moved the supper plate to sit between them on the workbench. And they had eaten in the barn in the cool October evening without further discussion of it. And it had been the most comfortable either of them had been since August. And the thing accumulating between them continued its accumulation in the warm lantern light of a clean barn on a piece of land that was by every measure that mattered still standing. Holcomb had come to the east fence on that October Monday with the ease of a man paying a routine neighborly visit and the precision of a man who had been planning this particular conversation for some time and had chosen his words and his timing and his exit with care. He was in his middle 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the sun-weathered face of someone who had spent 4 decades working land and the manner of someone who had long since learned that appearing reasonable was considerably more useful in most situations than appearing threatening. He had told Callum about the survey irregularity with the offhand delivery of a man sharing interesting local history between neighbors. He had mentioned in passing that the bank was aware of it. He had suggested it might be worth resolving before too much additional labor was invested in the east pasture. And then he had ridden away without waiting for a response. That departure was the most deliberate part of the whole conversation. The leaving before the ripples from the dropped stone had finished spreading, so that whatever Callum did with the information afterward would feel like his own reaction rather than Holcomb's intended and planned effect. Callum had driven the next fence post into the October ground without comment. Let the man take the measure of that silence and see what depth it returned. Samuel Pratt arrived from Abilene on a gray November morning riding a solid bay horse and carrying his instruments in 2 leather cases strapped behind the saddle with the careful arrangement of a man who has learned through costly experience that precision instruments do not forgive careless handling and are not replaced cheaply. Callum met him at the gate. They shook hands in the brief informational way of 2 working men who are communicating their relevant qualities through the handshake itself rather than through preamble. Pratt looked at the east fence line at the ridge where the old boundary marker stood, weathered and increasingly uncertain in the November light at the pasture beyond. You're thinking the error runs consistently along the full length of the eastern line, Pratt said. Thomas Whitfield thought so, Callum said. The notation at the county office suggests the instrument variation was in the compass reading rather than the chain measurement, which would make the error consistent rather than variable. Pratt looked at him with the mild and genuine surprise of a man who had been prepared to spend time explaining foundational principles and found they were not needed. You've pulled the original survey documents. Last week, county clerk pulled the file. Pratt nodded once. Then let's go see what the ground actually says. They spent 2 full days on the east pasture working methodically from the northern stake to the southern property line. Callum worked beside Pratt the way he worked beside anyone who possessed knowledge he did not yet have present and attentive, and not performing helpfulness, just genuinely absorbing the methodology with the patience of a man who understood that knowing what you were paying for was as important as being willing to pay for it. He held the rod when Pratt needed it held steady. He recorded the numbers Pratt called out into the field notebook in the careful columns Pratt specified. He asked 3 questions across the 2 days, each one chosen for the moment when the answer would mean something he could actually use. Marin brought coffee out to the fence line at midday on the first day and set it on a post without interrupting the work. She looked at the theodolite at the stakes already placed at the columns of numbers accumulating in the field notebook. She did not ask questions. She read the situation the way she read everything quickly and completely, taking in what was there without needing it explained, and went back to the farmhouse. The result came on the second afternoon as the November light was dropping early in the way it did when the cold was genuinely arriving rather than still threatening. Pratt stood at the final stake and looked at his calculations for a long moment with the expression of a man who is confirming what he already suspected rather than learning something new. Compass variation error, he said. Consistent across the full boundary length as you predicted. The 1874 survey placed the eastern boundary approximately 90 feet west of its correct location. He looked at the line of stakes at the ridge at the fence Callum had been rebuilding all autumn. The 40 acres Holcomb has been positioning to contest are by correct measurement, unambiguously Whitfield land. Callum looked at the stakes in the November ground and said nothing for a moment. 90 feet, the distance a man covers in 30 unhurried seconds. A measurement error made on a single afternoon in 1874 by a compass that had drifted never corrected sitting in a county file with a notation in a second hand for 12 years, while land changed ownership and a man built a cattle operation on it and married a woman and expanded the herd and borrowed money to expand it further and died of a fever in May and left his wife to hold the whole thing together against a neighbor who had known about the error long enough to make 3 separate offers, each one time for a moment of maximum vulnerability. How long to have the corrected documents ready, Callum said. Thursday, Pratt said. Filed at the land office Thursday morning if we go together. Thursday morning, Callum said. They rode back to the farmhouse in the early dark. Marin had supper on the table, the kitchen warm and close, with the smell of wood smoke and coffee and something that had been cooking through the afternoon. Pratt ate with the quiet appreciation of a man who spends most of his working days in the field with instruments and a field notebook and finds a kitchen meal and a table worth genuine gratitude. After Pratt had gone to the barn with a lantern and a blanket, Callum and Marin sat at the kitchen table with the field notebook between them and the lamp turned up to its full height. He told her all of it then. Not only the survey result, the full accounting. Thomas's note from April found the night before he gave his answer. The letter to Pratt, written the evening Holcomb walked away from the east fence without waiting for a response. The weeks of reading county records and walking the boundary line and building the picture of what Holcomb had been constructing over 3 years, patient, methodical waiting for the right combination of debt and isolation and legal vulnerability to make the taking of it feel like a transaction rather than a theft. He told it the way he had told her about the harness in the barn, starting at the beginning, in order not omitting the parts where his own delay in speaking might reflect badly on him. He had known since August. He had not told her because he had not yet understood the full shape of what he was dealing with, and handing her fear without a solution to put alongside it was not something he was willing to do. Marin listened without interrupting. She sat across the table with her hands flat on the surface and her dark eyes on his face, and she gave the information the full weight of her attention, the way she gave everything the full weight of her attention without performing reactions that would take up space better used for actual understanding. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the fire working through the wood and the November wind at the windows. You found that note in August, she said, the night before you gave me your answer. Yes, and you've been working on this since October. Since the east fence, he said. Since the day Holcomb dropped his stone in the water and rode away before I could respond. She looked at the field notebook between them, at the columns of numbers in his handwriting, recording 2 days of work that had just established with legal precision that the land she had been holding together through 8 months of difficulty and grief was exactly as much land as she had always believed it to be. He knew, she said, not a question. He's known for years, Callum said. Long enough to make 3 offers, long enough to build his patience around it. He was going to move when the combination of debt and probate and isolation made the legal complication easier to manage than you would be. The alternative being me, she said. The alternative being you, he said. The fire, the wind. The November dark beyond the kitchen window, where the first serious cold of the season was beginning to build in the way that the old-timers in Mill Creek had been reading in the sky and the behavior of the stock for weeks now. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday morning, first thing." She nodded. She looked at the field notebook one more time, then closed it with a clean motion and pushed it across the table toward him. "The North Pasture water situation has been unreliable since last week. Check it before we leave for town Thursday. Don't want to come back to a problem." "I'll check it at first light," he said. She stood from the table and took her lamp from the corner shelf. At the doorway to the hall, she stopped without turning around. "Callum." "Yes." "Thank you." She said it differently than she had said it after the wedding, not the controlled exhale of a person whose arithmetic had just improved. This was something with more weight to it. The specific gratitude of a woman who has been managing everything alone for long enough that being managed for in the right direction by someone paying close enough attention to do it before being asked arrives with a weight she had not anticipated and cannot entirely account for. She went down the hall. Callum sat at the kitchen table with the field notebook and the lamp and the sound of the fire for a while longer and thought about Thursday and about what came next. The corrected survey was filed with the Mill Creek Land Office on Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, someone had cut the east fence. Not one section, 3 sections. A quarter-mile of wire dropped to the frozen ground in the dark. The post pulled and laid aside with the methodical efficiency of men who had done this kind of thing before and knew precisely how long it took and how much noise it made and how far the sound carried on a cold November night. 60 head of cattle pushed through the 3 gaps into the open ground between the Whitfield eastern boundary and Holcomb's western fence line territory that sat in a legal space complicated enough that cattle found grazing there in the dark could be claimed to have drifted or to have been pushed, depending entirely on who was asked and when and what they were prepared to swear to. The plan was not theft. Theft was simple and left direct evidence and had direct remedies. This was something more sophisticated: 60 cattle in disputed territory 2 days after a corrected survey had been filed with a neighbor's lawyer, ready to file counterclaims that would tie the question up through winter and into spring, while Holcomb's position hardened and Marin's operation ran progressively shorter on animals and the capital to sustain them. Callum found it at 5 in the morning. He had been up since 4, the habit of cold weather worry working at the back of his mind in the low, steady way it worked on any man responsible for animals, when the temperature was dropping fast and the weather building in the Northwest had been building for 3 days in a way that the old-timers read as serious. Not panic, just the persistent, attentive alertness of someone who understands that the difference between bad and catastrophic is maintained by attention and nothing else, and that attention requires getting up before you feel entirely ready. He found the first gap at the northern end of the east fence line, rode south and found the second, rode south again and found the third. 300 yards of fence down the frozen ground showing the boot prints and hoof marks of men who had worked with purpose and without hesitation, the cattle already spread across a wide arc of open ground and moving east in the slow-drifting way of animals that had been pointed in a direction and given enough space to keep moving without feeling driven. He sat his horse into the pre-dawn dark and understood it completely. Then he turned and rode for the farmhouse. He tied his horse at the barn, went inside, walked down the hall, and knocked twice on Marin's door. "East fence," he said. 3 sections down. Cattle are out." A brief silence. 4 seconds. "How far east?" "Moving toward Holcomb's line." "Men out there." "I saw tracks, 3 horses." A shorter silence, then the sound of boots on the floor. He went to the kitchen and took his rifle from the rack above the door and checked it and put his coat on. When Marin came out of the hall, she was fully dressed, rifle already and hand coat already on. She moved through the kitchen without a word and went directly to the barn. He followed. She was already saddling her horse when he came in. "You don't have to," he started. "They're my cattle," she said. The way she said everything that was beyond discussion, not sharply, not as argument, not as the performance of independence for anyone's benefit. Simply as a statement of what was true delivered by someone who had settled what was true and saw no reason to revisit the settlement. He saddled his own horse, and they rode out together into the November dark, and Callum thought about the woman he had known for 3 months, the woman who had opened a door with a ledger and told a stranger what she needed without apologizing for the strangeness of needing it. The woman who had set a supper plate between them on a workbench in the barn and said there's enough for 2. The woman who had sat across a kitchen table and listened to everything he told her about the thing he had been working on alone for weeks, and when he finished, had said Thursday and then asked about the North Pasture water. This was what it looked like when someone had decided something was not going to fall and meant it in every weather and at every hour. He had seen determination before in the people and animals who survived seasons they had no business surviving. He had never seen it look precisely like this. He hoped he did not stop seeing it any time soon. They found the herd spread across nearly a mile of open ground, moving east in scattered groups through the dark and the cutting cold of a November night that was becoming something more serious. Not panicked, pushed deliberately by people who understood how cattle move and had used that understanding to guide them east without the pressure that might have caused them to scatter in ways that made recovery impossible. Maren read the ground the same way he did. She pulled her horse up beside his at a low rise and looked at the spread of cattle below and the tracks in the direction of drift. Heading for the gap in Holcomb's south fence, she said, the one he never repaired after last summer. You know that gap. I know every gap on every boundary line of this property, she said. Thomas showed me the first year, said a rancher who doesn't know their own perimeter doesn't actually know their land. She was already moving, cutting south to get ahead of the group farthest east. Take the north cluster. I'll handle these. He went north. He found 2 of Holcomb's men at the eastern edge of the open ground, sitting their horses in the dark with the particular stillness of men who are waiting for a process to complete itself and have been told to wait rather than push. Not moving the cattle, simply positioned to prevent them from being turned back easily. Present the way a closed door is present, not doing anything, just being there. Callum rode directly at them. No rifle raised, no threat made. Just a man riding directly at 2 other men in the dark, with the specific composure of someone who has decided what is going to happen and is not interested in any of the preliminary exchanges that usually precede it. One of the men said, "This ain't your range." "It is actually," Callum said. He stopped his horse 10 feet out and looked at the first man in the moonlight. The corrected survey was filed at the land office Thursday morning. Eastern boundary has been on the county record since yesterday afternoon. You're welcome to go verify that. The man said nothing. The second man shifted. "I'm going to move my cattle now," Callum said. "You can help, or you can go back to Holcomb and tell him the survey is filed and the cattle are home. And tell him one thing besides." He held the first man's eyes without aggression and without uncertainty. "The next time anyone pulls my fence posts in the dark, I will not come out to the conversation alone." A long silence. The wind picking up from the northwest, the temperature dropping in the specific way that meant the weather that had been building was arriving now rather than tomorrow. The second man said something low to the first. The first man looked at Callum for another moment with the expression of a man revising an estimate of a situation he had thought he understood. Then both of them turned and rode east without another word. Callum watched them go. Then he went to work. By the time he and Maren had the full herd gathered and moving back west through the repaired gaps, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the first snow was coming in, not the tentative early season snow that announces itself and retreats, but the deliberate, committed kind that arrives with every intention of staying. They worked the cattle through the fence gaps, and Callum braced the posts temporarily sufficient to hold through the night enough to keep the herd contained until proper repairs could be done in daylight. The snow was falling harder by the time the last animal was through. Maren looked at the sky the way a rancher reads a document they already know the conclusion of. "How serious?" Callum said. "Serious," she said. "The old-timers have been saying since October. Too many signs pointing the same direction." She looked at the temporarily braced fence at the snow accumulating on the wire. "We need the north herd moved to the lower pasture at first light, and the windmill needs checking before it freezes." "I'll start at dawn," he said. "We'll start at dawn," she said. She was already riding for the barn. The winter of 1886 came down on the Texas plains with the indifferent, comprehensive thoroughness of a force that has no particular quarrel with anything and simply proceeds at the scale it always proceeds at. The old-timers would call it the big die-up in the years afterward, once the full accounting had been done. The blizzard season that killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the western ranges, from Texas north to Montana, that broke open range operations that had survived every previous hardship, that ended ways of doing things that had seemed as permanent as the land itself. In Mill Creek County, the temperature fell to 22 below zero in January. The creek froze hard enough to drive a loaded wagon across without concern. The windmill on the north pasture seized in the second week of December and had to be freed by hand in conditions that burned exposed skin in minutes and turned the simplest mechanical task into a sustained negotiation between a man's intention and the cold's complete indifference to it. Callum freed it twice. The second time took 2 hours in wind that was coming in sideways off the open plain, and he came back with ice in his beard and the deliberate energy-conserving movements of a man who has learned to manage his body's resources in conditions that do not allow for waste. Maren had hot coffee on the table when he came in. She did not remark on it or make a production of having it ready. She put it in front of him and returned to what she had been doing, which was calculating remaining hay supply against a projected continuation of the cold at its current severity, because that was what the hour and the situation required. They worked as if sleep were a logistical matter to be addressed in the gaps between necessary tasks rather than a biological requirement with authority over their schedule. The cattle demanded constant specific attention, not just feed and water, but the kind of close observation that comes from understanding that an animal's condition in extreme cold deteriorates faster than its appearance, suggests that an animal looking merely cold in the morning may be in genuine danger by afternoon if the morning reading is not acted on. They lost 7 cattle in the first week. Not through any failure of attention or effort, through the arithmetic of extreme weather applied to animals already carrying the stress of a hard autumn, and a cut fence and 60 cattle pushed through the dark in 2 months of cold before the worst had arrived. Callum buried them in the frozen ground with the grim practicality of a man who understood that grief over what could not be helped was energy spent in the wrong direction, and that what could still be helped required all the energy that remained. They saved 11 more that would otherwise have joined those 7. Saving them meant bringing cattle into the barn, into every enclosed space that could be made to hold warmth against the sustained assault of the cold. At the worst point in January, with the temperature holding at 20 below for 5 days without relief, they brought 3 calves into the kitchen itself. It was not a sentimental decision, and neither of them treated it as one. It was the decision of 2 people who had looked at the numbers. These 3 calves would not survive the night in the barn without continuous human intervention. And continuous human intervention in the barn at 20 below, for the hours required, was not sustainable and had arrived at the only solution the numbers permitted. The calves spent 48 hours beside the kitchen stove, wrapped in blankets that Maren pulled from the cedar chest in the bedroom. With the matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to every resource on the property it was needed, it was available. The connection between those facts required no ceremony. The kitchen smelled of cattle and wood smoke and the coffee that was always on. The ledger sat open on the table with the calves arranged in their blankets in the corner nearby, and Maren did the accounts while Callum slept 4 hours on the narrow couch in the front room, and then they traded. They did not discuss the 4 terms of their original arrangement during this period. There was no space in the days and nights for discussion of anything except the immediate problem and the one that would follow it. They communicated in the shorthand of people who have worked alongside each other long enough that the full sentence is no longer necessary. A glance, a nod, a question in 4 words, and an answer in 3. The efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's thinking well enough to stop translating between what is said and what is meant. On the worst night, January 14th, temperature at 22 below, wind, loading the barn door with enough pressure that opening it required 2 people pushing against it together. Callum came in from the north pasture at midnight. He had been out since 10 o'clock. 2 cows had separated from the main group and were sheltering badly against the north fence and getting them back to the barn, and through the door had taken 2 hours in conditions that reduced visibility to the reach of an arm and made every direction feel identical to every other direction. He had found his way back by the sound of the windmill and by memory, and by the particular refusal of a man who has told himself he is coming back to allow the cold to renegotiate that promise. He came through the kitchen door. His right hand would not close. 3 fingers, the index, the middle, the ring, had the specific, ominous quality of numbness that a man who has worked in cold weather learns to recognize as the beginning of something that needs addressing immediately rather than in the morning. Marin was at the table. She looked up when he came in, looked once at his right hand, and stood. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. She brought the lamp close and examined his fingers without touching them, yet assessing first completely the way she assessed everything before she committed to a response. Then she began to work. She did not ask how long he had been out or how it had happened. She said only the practical things the process required: hold this position. Relax that, tell me when this feels different. Her hands were entirely steady. Her face had the quality it had when she was managing something serious without performing her feelings about it, not because she did not have feelings about it, but because expressing them would use resources that the situation required elsewhere. She worked on his fingers for 20 minutes. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire in the stove and the wind against the walls and the occasional sound from the calves in the corner, who had become over 48 hours considerably more comfortable in a kitchen setting than was going to be practical for their long-term development as cattle. The lamp made warm, close light on the table on her hands, working steadily on his, on the ledger open to the January accounts. The color began to come back. Callum watched her bent over his hand in the lamplight and thought about 28 years of moving through other people's land, about the bunk houses and the line camps where the walls were thin and the pay was fair and the belonging was not part of the arrangement, about the nails he had driven into other men's barns and the hollow echo they made and the riding on when the season turned, about the specific loneliness of a man who is always useful and never belonging and has talked himself into believing that the difference between those two things is freedom. He had spent 28 years listening for the sound a nail made when you drove it into something that was genuinely yours. He had not expected it to sound like this, like steady hands on his frostbitten fingers at midnight in the worst winter in 30 years, like 3 calves and blankets from the cedar chest, like a ledger always open on the kitchen table, and coffee always on the stove, and a rifle above the door for the mornings when the situation called for it, like the accumulated weight of 9 months of shared difficulty and shared decisions and shared work on 300 acres of good Texas land. He had not expected it to look like this woman, but there it was, solid and real and entirely certain. "Marin," he said. She looked up from his hand. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the dark eyes that had been deciding things since August. Not the assessment she had given him at the door, not the recalibration of the bank meeting, not the quiet shift of the supper plate, moved between them on the barn workbench. Something that had been accumulating longer than any of those single moments. Something that had been growing steadily through the work, in the cold, in the cut fence, in the 48 hours of calves beside the stove, and every morning before sunrise and every night past dark. "They're your hands too," she said. "This is your land too." She went back to his fingers. Callum looked at the kitchen, the stove, the lamp, the ledger on the table, the calves in the corner, the coffee that was always on, the rifle above the door. He had driven the nail. He had heard the echo. It was different exactly as he had always believed it would be. The sound filled the kitchen at midnight in January and left no room for the hollow resonance of borrowed work, borrowed land, borrowed belonging. There was nothing hollow in it. It was entirely his, and he knew it with the completeness of a man who has been listening for a specific sound for a long time and recognizes it the moment it arrives. He was not going anywhere. The cold broke in the second week of February. Not dramatically the way hard things sometimes break, not with announcement, but with a gradual and almost reluctant loosening, a degree of temperature at a time. Until one morning, the air coming through the barn door had a quality that was merely cold rather than hostile, and the light on the snow had shifted from the flat white of deep winter to something that carried at its edges the faint tentative suggestion of a season still weeks away. Callum noticed it at first light on a Thursday, standing at the barn door, with his coffee watching the east pasture emerge from the February dark. The snow was still deep over the frozen ground. The creek was still locked. The windmill had seized again overnight and would need attention before midday. 7 cattle were in the ground, and 11 more were still recovering, and the kitchen calves had been returned to the pasture 3 days ago, with the mixed results of animals that had spent 48 hours beside a kitchen stove and were still working out the implications of that experience. The operation had held, not without cost, not easily, but it had held through everything the winter had brought against it, and the animals that remained alive were alive because of decisions made in the dark, in the cold, by 2 people who had stopped consulting the original terms of their arrangement sometime around the night of the cut fence and had not found it necessary to restart that consultation since. He was thinking about this, about the terms, about what had been growing between them in the space the terms used to occupy, about the specific way 2 people become known to each other through sustained difficulty, and what that knowledge becomes when it has nowhere else to go, when he heard the horse coming from the east. He looked up. Wade Holcomb was riding in along the fence line at a walk, alone. No hired men at his flanks, no lawyer with a document case, none of the apparatus of a man arriving to execute a plan. Just Holcomb on a gray horse in the February morning light, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has already made his decision and is taking the time the trip requires. Callum set his coffee on the fence post and waited. Holcomb pulled up 20 feet out and looked at the east fence rebuilt in December, with posts set deeper and wires strung tighter than the original built by a man who intended this to be the last time the line required rebuilding. He looked at the survey stakes Pratt had set frozen solid into the ground, now their positions unambiguous in the February light. He looked at Callum. He had lost 30 head in the big die-up. Callum had learned this from Ruth Finley, who had it from the feed store, who had it from one of Holcomb's own men in the first week after the worst broke, and people began emerging from their operations to compare what remained. 30 head off a 500-acre operation was a significant loss, significant enough to change the financial arithmetic of the spring and make the year ahead more complicated than the year before it. The Whitfield operation had lost 22. "Mr. Danner," Holcomb said. "Mr. Holcomb," Callum said. The February morning sat very still around them, the particular stillness that follows a sustained period of violent weather, the pause of something that has used itself up and has not yet determined what it intends to do next. "Hard winter," Holcomb said. "Hard winter," Callum agreed. Holcomb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the survey stakes, and then at the fence, and then at the cattle moving slowly through the east pasture in the morning light, the herd that had come through the winter that had broken better resourced operations than this one. The operation a drifting ranch hand had arrived at in August with a saddlebag and a willingness to answer questions about land he had read about in a ledger. "I've been watching this property for 3 years, Holcomb said finally. Not a confession, not an admission intended to invite response. The plain statement of a man who has decided to speak directly because the time for the other kind of speaking has passed. "I know," Callum said. "Thomas was a decent man." "He was," Callum said. "He wasn't always careful, but he was decent." Holcomb looked at the east pasture. "After he died, I thought the situation was going to resolve itself in a particular direction." He paused. "I made 2 offers while he was alive, both fair." "She refused both," Callum said, "because the price was never the question." Holcomb was quiet again. The gray horse shifted its weight and settled. "No," he said after a moment, "I expect it wasn't." A long silence. "I'm going to say one thing directly," Callum said. He kept his voice entirely level, without heat, the way you speak when you want to be heard rather than to prevail. Marin Whitfield has been on this land her entire adult life. She built this operation alongside Thomas, and she held it standing after Thomas died, and she did it through a bank looking for reasons to call the note, in a winter that took 30 head from better-equipped operations than this one, and neighbors who looked at a woman carrying a debt and saw an opportunity rather than a person. He looked at Holcomb steadily. She buried her husband on this land. She is not alone on it anymore. I want to be sure we understand each other fully on that point before we conclude this conversation. Holcomb held his gaze for a long moment. It was the look of a man taking a measurement he had not expected to need to take. Not of the fence or the stakes or the operation behind them. Of the man standing in front of him, a man who had arrived with nothing and had built something in 9 months that had survived the winter that Holcomb himself had not come through unscathed, who was standing here in February with the settled certainty of someone who has found the thing he was looking for and is entirely finished looking. Holcomb nodded once, not small and not large. The nod of a man who has done his complete accounting, arrived at a conclusion, and is acknowledging it without theater. Not defeat, something more considered than defeat. The decision of a man who looks at what is actually in front of him and chooses to be a neighbor rather than continue being a problem, because continuing to be a problem will cost more than it returns. The boundary stands, he said. It does, Callum said. Holcomb looked at the east pasture one final time. Then he turned his gray horse and rode east along the fence line at the same unhurried walk he had arrived at and did not look back. The February morning closed behind him the way open country closes behind a rider, completely as though the space had never been interrupted. Callum watched him go until the horse and rider had passed the tree line and were gone. Then he picked up his coffee from the fence post. Then he went to fix the windmill. Spring came the way it always comes after a hard winter. Slowly at first, tentatively a degree of warmth at a time, and then with gathering confidence until the snow cover broke in the low areas, first where the drainage ran best, and the creek came unlocked in the second week of March, with the sound and energy of water that has been still far longer than it intended to be. Marin noticed the first green in the east pasture on a Wednesday morning and came to find Callum in the barn where he was working on the north pasture water intake, which had taken damage in the freeze and needed to be addressed properly before the spring calving made competing demands on the available time. She stood in the barn doorway with the morning light at her back. The east pasture is coming in. He looked up from the fitting. Early. Right on time, she said. Thomas always said the east pasture came first because of the drainage slope on that side. He was right about that. She looked at the pasture visible through the open barn doors at the thin, clean line of new green in the low morning light. He was right about some things. He was right about Pratt, Callum said. She looked at him with the particular look, the assessing one, the one that was deciding whether to say what was behind it. He was right about Pratt, she agreed. She went back to the house. Callum went back to the fitting. But the morning had shifted in the way mornings shift when something is said that acknowledges what has not been said directly yet, and the shift stayed in the air between the barn and the kitchen for the rest of the day, present and patient. The spring calving came in well. 5 new animals in March, 4 more in April. The herd that had stood at 53 in August and fallen to 46 through the winter, climbing back to 48 by the end of March and to 58 by the end of April. Not the expansion Thomas had borrowed for. Real growth of a different kind, the kind that comes from a herd managed through genuine difficulty rather than only through good seasons. In April, Callum wrote to his father, the first letter in 3 years. He had not found what to say for 3 years, not because there was nothing but, because what there was required a ground to stand on, a context that would make the words mean something beyond their surface. For 3 years, the letter had been waiting in the back of his mind for a moment when he had something worth reporting beyond the name of the current ranch and the current state of the cattle market. In April, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and Marin's ledger open on the table and the sound of 58 cattle moving through the east pasture beyond the barn, he had known what to say. He wrote 3 sentences. I found a place. I'm staying. I'll write more when the spring work settles. He left the letter on the kitchen table to dry before folding it. When he came back, it had been moved slightly, returned to exactly the position he had left it, but at a different angle. The angle of something that has been carefully picked up and set carefully back down. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. But the letter was sent, and what it meant moved quietly between them without requiring discussion. On a morning in the second week of May, Callum and Maren walked the east fence line together, checking the wire after the final thaw. They moved with the ease of two people who have learned a piece of land well enough that checking it is not discovery, but confirmation, not learning where the problems are, but verifying they are not yet there. The survey stake stood solid. The fence held. The east pasture beyond it was coming in strong with the good grass that follows a hard winter, the kind of growth that comes from ground that has been broken open and forced to renew itself from the roots. They reached the southern end of the fence line, and Maren stopped. She stood looking at the boundary stakes at the fence at the pasture beyond. Then she looked farther east at the low rise beyond Holcomb's fence line, where a stand of post oaks marked a corner of the property that Thomas had particularly liked for reasons he had explained to her once in the first year of their marriage that she had not fully understood then and understood better now. "There's something I want to show you," she said. She led him off the fence line and slightly south to a place in the pasture where the ground rose gently toward a flat limestone shelf overlooking the creek. The view from there covered the full sweep of the eastern boundary and most of the south pasture and the farmhouse and barn below, everything they had worked on and worked to keep together. There was a wooden marker at the edge of the limestone shelf, modest, weather-worn, set into the ground with the specific permanence of something placed with intention. Thomas Whitfield, 1848-1886. He loved this land. Callum stood beside her and looked at the marker and at the view Thomas had looked at and at the land below that Maren had held through everything the year had brought against it. "I used to come up here in the fall," she said, "after he died, when I was trying to figure out if I could actually keep it going." She was quiet for a moment. "I stopped coming up here sometime around October." He did not ask why October. He knew why October. She turned and looked at the east fence line below the line that had been cut in the dark and rebuilt properly, and was standing now with the survey stakes beside it, marking what was unambiguously hers. "He would have liked knowing the survey was right," she said. "He knew it was right," Callum said. "He just didn't have time to prove it." She looked at the marker for another moment. Then she turned and started back down toward the fence line. He walked beside her. They checked the rest of the wire in the comfortable silence of two people who have said what needed saying and do not need to fill the space after it with anything except the work. That evening, a Thursday, Maren was at the kitchen table with a ledger when Callum came in from the south pasture later than he had intended because the irrigation ditch on the south end had needed more attention than it had appeared to require, as things on working land frequently do. He washed up at the basin and sat across from her, and she slid the open ledger toward him without looking up from her own book. He looked at where she was pointing, the salary column, $40 a month. 5 months of entries, September through January, each one recorded in the careful hand that Maren applied to everything in the ledger, with the belief that accurate numbers were not just practical, but something closer to honest. Beside each entry in his own handwriting were 3 words. Return to operation. He had known she would find it. It was in the ledger, and she read the ledger the way other people breathe regularly, completely without interruption. He had not hidden it and had not planned a particular moment for her to find it. He had put the money back because the operation needed it in those months, and there was no reasonable argument for doing otherwise, and he had not wanted to make a transaction of it or bring it to the table as evidence of something or as the foundation of a claim. $200. 5 months of $40 that had never left the operations accounts. Maren looked up from the ledger and found him already looking at her. "You've been returning your salary to the operation," she said. "The operation needed it," he said. "Every month, for 5 months, without saying anything about it. There was work to do," he said. "The money was better used in the operation than anywhere else." "Callum." "Yes." She set her book down flat on the table. "You could have left," she said, quiet, without accusation, with the specific weight of someone who has been carrying a thought for some time and has arrived at the right moment to set it down. After Holcomb's men cut the fence and drove the cattle out in the dark. After the windmill seized twice and 7 cattle were in the ground, and 3 calves were living in the kitchen, and the temperature held at 22 below for 5 straight days. After all of it. She looked at the 5 entries in his handwriting at the 3 words beside each one. The original term didn't require any of what you did. Not the survey, not the night with Holcomb's men, not the winter. None of it was in the 4 terms. No, he said, none of it was. So why did you stay? He looked at the ledger, at the full accounting of everything built and lost and rebuilt across 9 months, the debt diminishing the herd, recovering the salary column with its 5 quiet notations. Then he looked at her. I want to talk about the terms, he said. She waited. They've been expired since November, he said. We've been working without a contract since before the big die-up started. I'd like to propose new terms. He looked at her with the directness he had used at the east fence with Holcomb's men in the dark, not as aggression, not as performance, but with the settled certainty of a man who knows what he is and what he wants, and does not need to dress either of those things in anything other than the plain truth of them. I'd like the arrangement to be permanent, not because of the land, though I intend to work it and keep it as long as I'm able, not because of the bank or the debt schedule or the $40 a month I haven't actually been keeping, not for any practical or legal reason. He held her eyes. Because of you. Because of this. He looked at the kitchen around them, the stove with the coffee always on the lamp turned up warm, the ledger open on the table between them, the rifle above the door for the mornings that called for it, the place that had been a property he worked and had become, in 9 months of shared difficulty and shared decisions and shared nights when the barn door required 2 people and the temperature required everything. Both of them had the only place in 28 years that had ever returned the right echo when he drove a nail into it. I want it to be a real marriage, not because the law requires it to be called that, or because the bank's paperwork is served by the designation. Because it is one. It has been one for longer than either of us has said so. And I'd like to stop pretending the original terms still describe what we actually are. The kitchen was very quiet. Marin looked at him for a long time with the dark eyes that had been deciding things since August. The eyes that had assessed him at the door in August and found him worth a night's consideration, and that had been revising that assessment steadily upward through every month that followed. Through the bank meeting and the east fence and the supper plate moved between them on the workbench and Holcomb's men in the November dark and 22 below, and 3 calves in blankets and his hands in hers at the kitchen table at midnight in January. Callum, she said. Yes. It became a real one somewhere around the calves in the kitchen, she said. I expect you knew that. He looked at her. She stood up from the table. She crossed the 2 feet of kitchen between them. 2 feet that had been for 9 months the carefully observed distance of a practical arrangement, the space both of them had maintained without discussing the maintaining of it, the gap between what the terms described and what had actually been accumulating in the kitchen and the barn and the east pasture, and every morning before the sun and every night past dark. She kissed him, not tentatively, not as a question or a proposal, with the complete and unhesitating conviction of a woman who makes her decisions carefully and keeps them without qualification, who had opened a door in August with a ledger in her hand and asked a stranger for something no one expected her to ask for, and had received in return something she had not known to include in the asking. He kissed her back with the certainty of a man who had driven a nail into something that was his and heard the right echo and recognized it the moment it arrived. Outside, the Texas spring evening settled over the land they had decided together to keep. The east fence was standing rebuilt with posts set deep and wire strung tight. The herd was growing 58 and climbing with the spring calves. The survey was filed and the boundary was clear, and the stakes were frozen into the ground where Pratt had placed them. The debt was on schedule, not one payment late, the most current note in Burton Crane's portfolio. Wade Holcomb was being a tolerable neighbor and had given no indication of intending to be otherwise. The windmill was working. The south pasture ditch had been repaired and was holding well. The letter to his father had been sent and had received a reply that was short and direct and said, "Come visit when you can," which was more than 3 years of silence had offered and was enough. Maren Whitfield had opened a door in August with a ledger in her hand and told a stranger plainly what she needed. She had been refused twice before, and she had asked anyway because she had looked at her situation with the clear eyes of a woman who does not allow arithmetic to be revised by sentiment, and had found the one door the law had left open and had walked through it without performance or apology. That had taken something that could not be accounted for in the 4 original terms and could not be replaced by anything the law or the bank or a neighbor's patience could offer. She had built this operation and held it through a husband's death and a bank's timeline and a neighbor's years of careful waiting and the worst winter in a generation. And she had done it because she had decided it was not going to fall. And decisions made that clearly and kept that completely were the only thing that had ever actually held anything together against everything that worked to pull it apart. Callum Danner had knocked on her door looking for honest work and had found before he knew he was looking for it a reason to stop moving. He had followed her inside. He had read her ledger and written to her surveyor and rebuilt her fence and stood in the dark in November and worked beside her through January and driven the nail and heard the echo and known it immediately for what it was. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was on. The ledger was on the table where it always was, and the coffee was on the stove where it always was. And the May evening outside was settling into the full quiet dark over 300 acres of good Texas land that belonged to both of them completely. The east fence was standing. The work had been the whole point. The work and the land and the person you did it beside, and the particular sound a nail makes when it goes into something that is genuinely yours. Solid and final and different from every borrowed echo that came before it, filling the chest and staying there long after the hammer is set down.